try to answer the requests that have come to me and fill in this last hour or so with the things that minister to your needs. I would like to say that it thrills us to know how the doctors are assisting us in this. There isn't any doctors in Laubach that are fighting us, for they all know that we are cooperating with them. We never work against them. We never say, don't go to the doctor. We always say, if you need a doctor, go to the doctor, and we'll pray for the doctor and pray for his guidance. And so the doctors know that we are their friends and they are our friends. In fact, the doctors frequently call us and ask us to pray for their patients that we did not know about. Now, that didn't happen in the beginning. And it happened because they saw, they had records of so many miracles that were taking place. And we didn't try to point it out and say, look what we did. For we've known from the beginning that we didn't do it, that we only became a little pipeline that God could use and do the thing that would glorify Him. I was flying to Louisville, Kentucky this past fall and reading J.G. Jung's book, Man in Search of a Soul. And I was thrilled to find this. Dr. Jung, as I'm sure all of us know, is one of those great Christian psychiatrists, not of this country, of Europe. But he was one of the first to awaken us to the wonder of the subconscious and the effect of religion on what we are. And in that book, he makes this statement, that in his lifetime, he had had people come to him from every civilized nation around the globe. He had kept a record of every patient he'd ever had. He had discovered that he'd never had a patient over 35 years of age, that when he followed it back to the root of their trouble, wasn't a lack of a vital religious experience. In other words, our lives have been made for God. And when we fail to find God in our lives and express His way, we're frustrated. I thought that was a great statement, but he went on to say this, that he had never been able to heal one of these patients until he'd been able to help them find this vital religious experience. He didn't say if they were a Jew, he tried to make them a Christian, but he did try to help them find the very best that they had, that they might live up to God's purpose within their lives. I thought that was quite significant. If you read Dr. William Sadler's book, there's a couple chapters on religion and health in that makes statements just about as strong as Dr. Jung. Yes, our doctors are being some of our very best allies. In one of our camps last summer, a doctor said to me, have you ever noticed your death notices, people who've died after they're 50? What they died from? He said, you'll find that it's always something that affected the soul. Because surgery and medicine and pills cannot take care of a soul disease. You watch. What is heart? He said heart's one of the most prevalent things. What's that come from? Tenseness. A Christian shouldn't live tensely. If you know you're made in His image and His Spirit lives within you, and He waits to direct you, we shouldn't live tensely. And when we learn to live relaxed, the heart condition takes care of itself. And so he went on to remind me of the so-called incurable diseases. Now, he said they're only incurable because the doctors cannot do anything for them. You can't cut it out and you can't give a pill for it. But where the doctors are wise enough to lead them into a confident, quiet living out of God's purpose for their lives, these things are overcome. We've had some amazing things brought to us in this past year regarding the subconscious method of prayer. In our little yellow booklet, A Challenge to Christians, I bring out this method of prayer. It's one of the most vital, potent of any kind of prayer you can ever make. And the Lord really gave it to us first. I've never heard of anyone using it as prayer until I was more or less forced into it. My nephew was one of the very first to be sent to the Pacific area in the Second World War. When he went out, he left a father and a mother and a happy home. He was a radio man, so he was in the very forefront of every advance and right out in the front of every island. And he was there from the very beginning until armistice was signed. And he came home utterly broken. Perhaps would have been broken anyhow, but in the meantime, his mother and father had both died. He came back without a home, in a completely broken condition. The only person that he seemed to be able to cling to was his fiancée. She had been true to him, and he wanted immediately to get married so he could just hang on to her. But she said, "No, John, we want to be happy. You're not in any condition now to make a happy home. The government will give you treatment and continue with you until you're well, and I'll continue to work and save for our home. You go and take advantage of what the government is offering." And so he entered one of these southern government hospitals. Now, when he entered, he gave her name to notify in case anything happened to him. He was getting along very nicely and making good progress when she was killed in an automobile wreck, and he became a raving maniac. They were 2 weeks finding the name of anyone to notify. But finally, they got my name and Norfolk and got in touch with me and had me come and tell them all I could of his background. Our government does try to help our boys when they're broken and after they have been broken in a cause of war. After I told them everything I could think of to help, I said, "Now what may I do?" They said, "We don't know anything you can do for a boy in this condition." I said, you don't think I might go to see him and talk to him? They said, "No, he's in a padded cell, in a straitjacket. You couldn't see him." Well, I said, "I suppose if I wrote?" "No," they said, "he's not capable of reading." Then I said, "It looks like I'm limited to prayer." He said, "That's all we know that you can do. And if the boy ever comes out, it will be through prayer." Now, I went home feeling a great responsibility, for I knew that my brother in heaven was counting on me helping that boy. The marvelous thing is, before there's a need, God always is there with the answer. Believe that. There's nothing you could ever face that God hasn't already faced it before you could, that he doesn't already have the answer and able to give it to you if you just give yourself to him and be sensitive. I went home praying, "Lord, what would you do? If this were your nephew and you were the one that is responsible for him, what would you do?" And the thought was given me of an article I'd read some months before in a scientific magazine. I like to read new things, and I'm not afraid to read new truth, a new facet of truth, because I measure everything by Jesus. If it measures up to him, I'll look at it a little farther. If it doesn't, I simply turn it loose. I wouldn't advise everybody to do that, but I'm not afraid to look at truth, for truth never denies Jesus. Now, this article was an amazing article on the subconscious mind. It told the power that resides within the subconscious of every soul. 9/10 of the human mind is subconscious. We think with 1/10 of our mind. We build with 9/10. And we build exactly what we think with our whole being. That's one of the great truth statements in the Bible. As the man thinketh in his heart, that is deep down within him. They didn't know anything about the subconscious. But heart was the word they used for this great power deep within man. As the man thinketh in his heart, so is he. And we are products of these things that we think and believe. We build them. Now, this article went on to say that very often the conscious mind is beyond helping itself. And a life seems to be lost because the conscious mind does not know how to direct that life. But others can help if they care enough. For the subconscious never sleeps. It will not take orders from anyone else while their conscious mind is awake. But when the conscious mind is asleep or in a coma, the subconscious will take orders from anyone who cares to give an order. Now, of course, I realize there's danger. For some people use it wrong. But we're not going to turn all the great powers over to those who use them wrong, are we? If we know there's a great power, are we going to say, oh, I won't use it because the evil people are using it? When we know that good is stronger than evil, and if we take hold of the good, why, we can defeat the evil. It gave the method of helping someone through the subconscious. They said every soul in the universe will recognize their own name when it's called. And no matter where they are, distance absolutely makes no difference. They could be thousands of miles away, but if you called their full name distinctly 3 times, it would alert the subconscious mind of that person, and they would listen, and they would do what you tell them to do. Now, they gave many instances of amazing things happening because someone else cared enough to help direct a life that had gotten beyond helping themselves. I thought it was a most interesting article. Certainly it never occurred to me that I would ever attempt to use it, but I did enjoy reading it. I had so completely dropped it that I couldn't remember what magazine it was in. But I did remember the method, that you called the full name 3 times. And then you said to that subconscious mind the things that you knew they needed to know. And so I prayed, Lord, you possess me so that you might direct me to say the things that John needs to know. You know what he needs to know. You know the poor boy is broken-hearted. You know he thinks that this is the end of mother and dad and his fiancée. We must make him know otherwise. Now, I knew they had him doped, and so I didn't have to wait until night to talk to him. I could start talking and talk all day, and that's just what I did. For my family were all away in the daytime, and I went around doing my work, talking out loud all day long. And every time I wakened at night, I would get up and go apart and talk some more. Now I said something like this after calling his name 3 times. I said, John, you know, death isn't what you think it is. Mother and Daddy and Madeline are not dead and buried and lying there asleep until the trumpet calls. They stepped from this realm into that greater realm. They're living more fully, more abundantly than they've ever lived. They're with Jesus. Now, if you'll give your life to Jesus and put yourself completely in his hands, you'll find they're with you, that they're as near to you as you are to Jesus. Jesus said heaven is within, and they're in heaven. And so they're right there with you, John. Now, relax. Give yourself into his keeping, and he'll make you know that they are near, and that they love you, and that they're living more wonderfully than ever before. But I knew that he needed more than comfort. We can't live the rest of our lives on comfort. We need a challenge that will push us out and make us do things. And so I said, John, you know, God put you in the world for a great purpose. There lies within your breast the pattern of a son of God and the power for it to become. Just as truly as there is the pattern of an oak tree in every acorn, and the power to become, there lies the pattern of a very wonderful boy within you. But the acorns do not become until they're given back to God. They have to be lost and buried for God to develop that miracle within. Now, John, just give yourself over to Jesus. He knows what he put you in the world to be. He knows how to get you there. And I promise you it will bring you happiness. It will satisfy. Just relax, John. Put yourself in Jesus' hands. And so all day long I talked to him like that. And in about 10 days, John called on the telephone. He said, Lula, I've been awfully ill. Oh, I said, you have, John? Yes, I have. Did you know Madeline was killed? Oh, John, really? Yes, but Lula, death isn't what you think it is. And then he began to comfort me, as though he thought I were going to pieces over the fact that she'd been killed. And he said back to me to comfort me everything I'd said to him. I sat there as though I were just in a trance, hearing everything said back to me that I had said to him. He was comforting me. And then he said, you know, Lula, Mother and Daddy and Madeline have been with me all the time I've been ill. They've been right in the room with me, so has Jesus. And they're always going to be with me. And you know, they're going to help me find my place in life. God has a place that he wants me to fill, and he's going to lead me into it. And I'm going to follow where he leads. Well, it was one of the greatest thrills in my life to hear everything said back, because it proved that this article was true and that it worked. Well, the amazing thing is that it continued to work. And in a month or so, John was dismissed from the hospital and went back to find that place in life that God was waiting to lead him into. And within a year, he'd found a Mary. And when he brought Mary to visit me, he said, you know, Lula, Madeline was wonderful, but I don't believe she could possibly have been as wonderful as Mary. And he and Mary have been developing God's plan for their lives ever since. Now, I thought I would never tell anyone. I had no idea of ever telling even my husband, because I didn't want anyone to think I'd gone fanatic and jumped off on a tangent. I was grateful to help him, but I thought that was the end. But almost immediately I began receiving letters from all over my conference, from homes where boys had come back broken, alcoholics that nothing seemed to be able to reach. And they'd say, Ms. Eggleston, can you suggest anything else? I couldn't hold back something that had blessed my boy and not tell them. And so I found myself writing a book to each one and telling them about this and what to say, and offering to help them say it. And in each instance, we saw the boys come back. That's when Frank Laubach made me write the book. I certainly didn't think I'd ever let the world know that I was a funny somebody, that I did things that most Methodists don't do, because really no Methodist ever wanted to be more orthodox than I. I was a Methodist minister's daughter, and I wanted to honor him. But you can't refuse to do the things that God gives you to do. And so I began helping so many people with this method. And each year when Frank Laubach would come to visit our group, he'd say, now tell me some of the things that have happened this year. And when we would tell him these stories, he'd just thrill. He said, now, Louise, you've got to write that. That is something so potent, and it'll help so many people that no other form of prayer seems to reach. You must write it. And I said, never, never, never. I just will not do it. But I was co-leader with him in Winnipesaukee Camp up in New Hampshire. He tried to get me to tell it to the camp, and I said, no, I just will not. But the next time he got up, he said, now, Louise has a new method of prayer. And he told so much about it that there wasn't any secret to it. Now, he said, next time she appears, you make her tell you. There wasn't any getting around it. So then after it was out, you might as well write it. You'll find it written in the little booklet back there, the full method. But the amazing thing is the way it's been going on and on and on. I want to tell you about a couple doctors that were in one of our camps last summer. They had asked me to talk about koinonia one night. And so I poured it out, for I believe that God is going to certainly use koinonia to flood the world with spiritually filled missionaries, technical missionaries. And so I poured it out and begged each one to go back to their church and have their church send more and more missionaries. For that's where the missionaries should go from, the church. We shouldn't have to be sending them from an organization outside the church. Of course, koinonia is interchurch. It's vitally Christian and represents the church, but how much better it is if every church would send their own missionaries. And so I'd made quite a plea for everyone to go back and multiply their missionary giving and going. The next morning, this doctor came to me and said, Ms. Eggleston, I didn't sleep any last night. I said, what's the matter with you? He said, you didn't let me. Well, I said, what did I have to do with it? He said, you put the world on my heart. As a young man, I wanted to go out as a missionary and was not permitted to go. Now, he said, I'm in the 50s. My children are married and they're independent. And so last night, my wife and I talked all night long. For you made me know that now the Lord was calling us to go. And so I've come to offer my life. Tell koinonia I'll go wherever there is a need for a doctor, and that I'm able to pay for our own support. Just tell me where the need is the greatest. You can imagine how thrilled I was with that. And then he said, I know another doctor here that couldn't sleep last night, and I believe that you can get him too. I said, go after him. So he came with this other doctor, and the other doctor said, well, now, my family's younger. I can't support myself. I said, well, we've never asked anyone to go out and support themselves, though laborers always worthy of his hire. But he said, I'll tell you what I can do. I've been trying to build my own hospital for more than 2 years. I have the plans all drawn, and I've tried a dozen times to let the contract, and every time it's been blocked. Last night I knew that God had blocked it, that he needs my hospital somewhere else in the world. And so, if you want me, just say where, and my hospital will be built wherever you say. Well, you can imagine, I was getting so thrilled, I was wondering if I was ever going to sleep again. And then he said, now he told on me, you make him tell you what his undertaker said to him the other day. And I said to the first doctor, what did your undertaker say to you? Well, he said, I didn't mean to tell that to anyone, but Bill? Well, I said, make me a bill and tell me. Well, he said, I met the undertaker on the street, and he said, say, Doc, do you know it's been 2.5 years since you've sent a single patient to me? And I said, yes, I believe it has. He said, believe? You know it has. If you'd been the only doctor in town, I'd have had to left this city a long time ago. But the other doctors are doing all right. So I'm doing all right. I want to know now, what's the secret? Well, he said, there is a secret. Of course, I never have a patient I don't pray for. But he said, that is not unusual. You'd be amazed how many doctors pray for their patients. So that isn't the answer. But he said, I do believe I have found a secret, and it's this. I've always had the opinion, or I have for years, that when the patient is under an anesthetic in the operating room, that they pick up everything that is being said and build it. I had a paper to write before the Medical Association, and I wrote on that. And I declared to my associates that they were all welcome to stand by in any operation I ever performed, but that there would never be a discouraging word ever uttered in my operating room again. They might point to anything or make notes, but if anyone ever made a discouraging word in my operating room, they could not come again. He said, there haven't been any. But I've gone more than that. Naturally, he said, I've had my share of patients that were inoperable. You sewed them up and knew that there was nothing that nature could do. But I knew there was always something that God could do. And so while they were under the anesthetic, I would call their name and I'd talk to them. And I'd say to them something like this. You know you're made of God's Spirit. You're made in his image. He not only made you, but he is rebuilding you every second. Every second of every day and every night. He's giving you millions of new cells fresh from God. And when these cells are given to your body, they have the wisdom of God. They know their function. And yet when they come to you, they take on the pattern of your thinking and believing. Now just relax. Give yourself to God. The Christ within you will direct your life forces. If you will turn your life completely over to him and let him direct all that happens within, you will have a new body in less than 4 months. For they say today that it takes only 3.5 months to replace every cell in the human body. He said, it's been the most amazing thing that I've ever watched, seeing these patients rebuild and come back to complete wholeness. I happened to tell that story in Myrtle Beach this fall. It was a woman's the South Carolina Women's Conference retreat. But they, in their eagerness to get everybody to attend, had headlined the papers with pictures and write-ups, and they'd told everything they knew about me. And two surgeons from up north who were vacationing in Myrtle Beach said, "This looks like it might be interesting. Here's a quack we might have fun with. Let's go." And so these two surgeons came to make fun, to tear to pieces. Now, as a rule, I don't tell subconscious stories in my first lecture. I usually plant orthodoxy. But something pulled this story of the two doctors. And these two surgeons that were sitting in the very back were among the first to get to me when it was over. They said, "Ms. Eggleston, that's the most amazing story you told I've ever heard. Could you give me the name of the doctors?" And I said, "I surely can." He said, "It's the most logical thing I've ever seen, and why we hadn't thought of it is more than I can think. I know the power. We've all studied the power in the subconscious mind. And why we would be so silly as to discuss all the problems and all the symptoms and make all the remarks that it's humanly incurable in the operating room." He said, "Oh, I do thank you. Have you got any more like it?" And I said, "Yes, some more." He said, "We'll be back every day." They were in every session of the woman's retreat. And I told a doctor story every time. I lured them along. I thought we'd make Christians of them anyhow. Well, here's another doctor story, and then I'm going to another type. I was going to one of our deep southern cities for a 3-day retreat, and I received word asking if I would mind staying in the home of a doctor. He was a very prominent doctor in the city, but that he had a great need that only prayer could take care of. I wrote and told them I'd be glad to stay with them. And so when I landed in the port, his wife was there to meet me. And as we drove home, she said, "Ms. Eggleston, I'm going to prepare you for what you're going to face. We have only one daughter, but she has always been a very exceptional daughter. She seemed to have more talents than most people. And of course, we gave her every advantage. We developed them. But her voice was so very exceptional that when she was in college down south, her voice teacher said, it would be a sin to keep a voice like this from the world. Why don't you take her to New York? Let her finish there at Barnard and put her under the best voice teacher in New York City." And so they persuaded the mother and father to take this lovely daughter to New York. Mother went with her. She found the right place for her to live and got her teachers and her classes and everything going, and then went back home. Now, she was getting along very nicely when one night, coming home from her voice lesson, she was attacked by a sex fiend who had escaped from prison. No one knows just what happened, but she was found naked and raving like a wild animal. Now, of course, her father did everything that money and influence and skill could do. There wasn't any place in the country that they didn't try to cure this lovely daughter. But she said, "Ms. Eggleston, after 5 years, she's still a wild animal. We can't keep any clothes on her. We can't have anything breakable in the house. She smashed everything that's breakable. And even though we have 3 guards, one each 8 hours, she's so quick, so strong, she eludes them. And she's broken everything in the home that's breakable. We want you to help us find an answer." Well, I knew that was a pretty hard one. As we entered the home, it was a large colonial home, and the stairway went up, and then there was a broad platform with triple windows, and then turned and came back again. As we started up the stairs, she heard her mother's voice and jumped past her guard and appeared at the top of the stairs, stark naked. And just as we reached the platform, she leaped upon us. And as she did, she tore all the draperies and curtains down, and we all came down in a heap. They rushed me in my room and said, "Keep the door locked. Don't come out until we come in." And of course, they went to get her quiet. And then Father and Mother came in. They said, "We don't have to tell you anymore, do we? You've seen it happen." Yes, and I said, "I've been doing a lot of praying. Of course, there isn't anything but God that can do this, and yet it isn't beyond God. He took the demoniac who was the terror of the neighborhood, who couldn't be chained because his strength was so great it would break the chains. And he made him completely sane and Christian. And he became such a witness for Jesus that when Jesus went back to Gennesaret again, they brought the sick from all the countryside around and laid them in the street that they might touch the hem of his garment as he passed by." Now I said, "She's no worse than that, is she?" "No," they said, "she's no worse than that. And God hasn't changed. He is just the same." Now I said, "He's the only way that can lead us into it. Let's be still and let him direct." And so we offered ourselves to him and listened. And I said, "Have you ever tried to work with her through the subconscious?" "Oh," he said, "yes, we put those records under a pillow and they only make her worse." Well, I said, "I'm not surprised, because you're not supposed to have something that the conscious mind could hear. Of course it would disturb her. Let's try it from a distance." And so we sat together and thought of what she needed to know, what needed to be planted deep in her subconscious thinking. We knew that first this terrible thing that had happened must be blotted out. It must be forgotten, separated from her as far as the east is from the west. And so we claimed that promise from Jesus. We poured out our love and asked him to just come in with his love and blot it out as much as if it had never happened, and then fill her with his love and his calmness, and let her be the person he put her in the world to be. Well, we sat and wrote just what we felt God would have us say. And then I said, "Now, whose voice soothes her more than anyone else?" And Father quickly said, "Mother's voice. Mother can soothe her when no one else can." And I said, "Tonight, when she's asleep, let Mother say this to her over and over and over, but of course from another part of the house, where it will not disturb her conscious mind." Now, Father said, "I'll see that she's well asleep." And then he told the guard on duty what to watch for, told her what we were doing, and said, "Now, when she's completely asleep, slip out and tell us. And then slip back in and watch what happens and report." The nurse came out in a little while and said, "She's asleep." And so Mother, from a distant part of the house, called her name distinctly 3 times and began to tell her that Jesus, who lived within her, had blotted this terrible experience out of her life, that she would not ever remember it anymore, and that he was calling her now to be the person that he put her in the world to be. And she talked and talked. It wasn't long until the guard slipped out and said, "I wish you could hear it." And the doctor slipped in to hear. It was like a little child after she'd sobbed herself to sleep, just relaxing and sighing and letting go and finding a peace and an ease. It was simply amazing to watch it as it happened. They knew it was working. The next morning, she slept all night calmly and sweetly. The next morning, the guard said, "Let me bring her down to breakfast. I believe I can get her dressed and bring her down. Let's see." And so they dressed her and brought her down to breakfast. Now, she was nervous like an animal that was watching for trouble, but she ate her breakfast and acted so much more normal than she had acted in the 5 years that they were thrilled. Now, the next morning after breakfast, we had another session. And the father said, "Now, Mother can't stay up every night doing this, for she's on the job all day, even though we have guards. Mother is on the job all day." Now, he said, "How about these records if we put them in another room?" I said, "All right. I believe that will do. If Mother makes the records and it's Mother's voice, and they're played from another room where she can't hear the voice itself, let's try it." And so Mother made the record, and they had one of these long playing machines that just kept repeating and repeating and repeating. That night, they played the record, and it seemed to have just the same effect as if Mother had talked. That girl has gone steadily forward. It's been one of the most amazing experiments you've ever seen. And she's back in college. It seems that she's utterly forgotten that anything ever happened to her. God just seemed to blot it out and separate it from her completely. Now, I suppose that's enough of the subconscious because we're still experimenting. But if you'll put only love and faith back of this, you may be sure that there won't be any harm from it. And we must use these powers for good and not turn them over to evil. Now, I think I promised. You want to turn your machine over? I promised to tell a story of another kind. Someone wanted a story that was not emotional, but organic. Well, that's just as easy. You know, the only hard thing is in our minds. That's the only block, is in our minds, in our hearts. It's no harder for God to heal a paralytic and a cancer than it is to heal some emotional stress. I remember this was surely 14 years ago, I'd say. It was in the beginning of the Second World War, when doctors were so busy that they just couldn't bother with cases where there was no help. Now, this young man in Norfolk, an automobile mechanic and considered the best in Norfolk, that you could just leave your car and know that no matter what had happened to your car, he'd find it. And you'd know that the price was going to be right. You could trust him. Now, one of my nice Presbyterian friends said to me, "Would you go with me to have a prayer for my automobile mechanic?" I said, "I'm not asking you to pray for healing." He was sewed up last fall, and this was in April. And now he's gotten to the place where the dope does not help the pain. And his pain is just unendurable. Won't you go with me and just pray for God to make it bearable or take him on? Well, I didn't like to say to her, "I don't tell God what to do." But I said, "I'll go with you." I knew I wasn't going to tell God what to do and to do that anyhow. But I met her and went with her. I had never seen anything that looked like him. For when they had sewed him up, it all of his vitals were completely encased with cancer, and they had simply disconnected the intestinal tract and made a side opening and left him with only dope until the end. Now, I had never seen anyone that had lived on dope for 5 months, starved to death. I'd seen pictures of starving people in Europe, but I'd never seen anyone that looked like him. Why, the bones seemed to stick out, and the skin was just stretched over it, and his eyes looked like great, big, sunken stars. When I walked in and saw him, everything within me went out in great compassion. And I knew just how Jesus felt when he had compassion on people. For I'd never seen anyone that I ever felt so sorry for as Charles Brooks. I went over and sat down beside him and put my hand over on his. And I said, you know, Charles, I was as near death's door as you once. And God brought me back to health and strength. I look all right, don't I? And he said, tell me about it. And so I told him of my 2 healings. It seemed to make him forget his misery and forget himself, and I was so glad to do something to help him forget. And when I finished telling of my 2 healings, he said, would you pray for me? Would you ask God to make me well? For I have so much to live for. I said, do you think that he would like to make you well? Why, he said, of course he would. You believe that he could? Why, yes, I believe he could. I said, that's all I want to know. Now, I said, you just close your eyes and relax. I'm going to offer myself to him as a little pipeline for him to let his love flow through, to make the touch. For Jesus reached out and touched them all, and they were all made whole. Now his abdomen sat out like a barrel, and I knew that was where the trouble was, so I put my hands on it, and I was shocked. It felt like cement. I'd never dreamed that people could get like that. But I tried not to appear shocked. He had closed his eyes and was waiting for something to happen. And so I stretched my hands as big as I could over that abdomen and asked Jesus to cover my hands with those nail-pierced hands and let the power of those hands go through mine and do for him just what Jesus would want done. I didn't try to tell him what. I only wanted what Jesus wanted. But as I prayed, I felt such a warmth and such a power come flowing through that I knew something was happening. And by the time I finished praying, Charles was snoring, sound asleep. I tiptoed out of the room and I said to his wife, don't waken him. Let him sleep as long as he wills. She said, well, Miss Eggleston, it's the first time he's gone to sleep without dope. Well, I said, he is asleep. Now let him sleep as long as he will. She said, will you come back tomorrow? I said, I'll be out of town tomorrow. I'm leaving early in the morning, but I'll be back tomorrow evening, and then I will see you. The next morning, before 7 o'clock, because she's afraid I would escape, she phoned and said, Miss Eggleston, would you write out that prayer you made and stop by and leave it for me? Well, I said, Bess, I don't know what I said. I never think of the words I'm saying. I just become a little channel and let God do what he wants. There isn't any magic in the words I said, Bess. Why? She said, he's just awakened. He slept from the time I made that prayer about 3:30 the afternoon before until the next morning. But she said, I haven't slept. All night long I have changed bandages and changed the bed. And she said, come by. He is as flat as you are. All of that pus is out of him. And he's flat and he's soft. I wish you could see it. And he doesn't have any pain. Well, I said I wouldn't have time before going, but I'll stop on my way back. But the only prayer you need make is just continually thanking God and tell him you want only what he wants. You want it in the way he wants it. And you were giving your life to him that he might do these things that will glorify him. Well, when I went back by in the afternoon, it was wonderful to see the difference. Of course, the flesh hadn't come back. But there was a brightness in the face and a glow and a freedom from agony. And the shape was all right. Well, it was marvelous watching him come back, regain his strength. For every day you could see a change in his condition. Now, the doctors had told him that they couldn't come to see him, that they would give him all the dope he needed, but they had too much to do to come to see him. She tried to get them to come by and see what had happened, and they said, Mrs. Brooks, we know that there's nothing we can do for him, and we really haven't time. So, in a few weeks' time, he was able to go to the doctor's office. And when he walked in, the doctor almost fainted because he knew that he was supposed to have been gone by now. And here he was. And he went in with this plea, Doctor, I'd like to have you reconnect my intestinal tract. I know I'm healed. And the doctor said, that's the craziest thing I ever heard of. I know what you are. I opened you and I saw it. And that's just completely crazy. Well, he said, will you tell me someone else that will? No, he said, there isn't anyone that has time to do foolish things. There isn't anyone that will. Then he said, I guess the great physician will have to do this too, won't he? He said, if it ever gets done, he will. Well, he said, I'm sure he will because he doesn't want me going through life like this. In another month's time, God reconnected his intestinal tract and the side opening began to heal. Now, I know these things just don't sound real and true, but we have the records for these things in Norfolk. We don't tell any story that can't be proven and checked up on. But the amazing thing is never what it does to the physical. It's always what it does to the spirit of the man and in making him a witness. Most of us are not very good witnesses because we don't have much to witness. But when you have something like that to witness, what a witness you are. Well, it was thrilling, and I began there by last of April. Now, by the last of June, he was completely well. He'd gone back to work. He'd been given more gifts than anyone I'd ever seen. He could understand any language that he heard, and yet he was only a high school graduate, and he'd never studied any language. But he just was given an understanding of languages. He would go in a kosher shop to get a loaf of bread, and he'd hear them speaking in Yiddish, and he'd say, were you saying so-and-so? And they'd say, oh, you know our language? No, he said, I don't know your language, but I seem to understand what you were saying. One day there came into the automobile place a foreign diplomat, and he couldn't make anyone understand what he wanted. And so Charles said, let me go talk to him. And Charles went and said, tell me. And he understood everything that he was trying to say, and he said, I'll fix it. It'll be ready for you. It amazed him as much as it amazed anyone else, but it humbled that he and his wife had not darkened a church door for many years. For about 15 years at least before, she used to be in charge of all the oyster suppers and the church suppers, and someone had hurt her feelings. Neither one had been to church since. I heard it. I knew that he couldn't keep this healing unless he got rid of that and came back and gave God the glory. So I began saying, now we're going to have a service in your church. We're going to give ourselves back to God and ask him to direct our lives. And he said, we'll have it here at home. And I said, no, I think we ought to go to the church. No, he said, we won't go to the church. We'll have it here. Well, he was adamant. So I went home to pray about it, and I said, Lord, what shall I do? Shall I be as adamant about it and say, now you will go to the church, or I'm finished? And then he said, no, just break his heart with the truth. And so I began praying, Lord, what can I do to make him see? And he had planned it. He said, now, let's invite everybody that we know that's been helping, been interested in this, and let them come to our house that afternoon, and we'll just have a prayer service, and we'll give ourselves to God anew. So I said, all right, I'll try to plan it. And as I prayed, the Lord gave me just the right program that made you confess, made you look at all these things within you that you had to bring out before you could keep a victory. And I had enough of them for everyone there to have one of these papers. So we planned it. Now we had quite a large group there, and we went through with it. Everyone confessed their weaknesses, asked for forgiveness, asked God to make us better witnesses and make us better representatives of his church. And then we all knelt to pray. Now, I had asked him before if he knew his new minister. I knew they had a new minister. Said, no, he hadn't met the new one. He hadn't been here long. And I had said, don't you want to invite him? No, he said, he doesn't know me. He wouldn't understand. And so he didn't want the minister. But just as we knelt to pray, it was a summer day. It was the second day of July. The windows were open, and there were bay windows out on the porch. And there was a couch in the bay window, and really, those who sat on the couch were on a par with part of the porch. And with the windows open, it was just as though they were on the porch. But we all had our eyes closed, and we were all kneeling. Now I heard someone come up on the porch, and then I didn't hear any more. And so I thought, well, whoever it was just went on, and we didn't pay any attention. Everyone prayed. Everyone confessed. Everyone asked God for grace to live as he would have us live. And when we arose from our knees, the doorbell rang. And Bess Brooks went to the door, and she came in just bubbling. And she said, oh, this is our new minister, and introduced him. And he said, well, I came to see the ill man. And she said, well, here's the ill man. He's not ill anymore. He's well. Well, he said, what's happened? Well, I saw their joy and just spilling it over and telling this new minister what happened. So all the rest of us slipped out and left those two alone with their new minister. A couple hours later, Bess phoned and said, Ms. Eggleston, he said, it's all right. We'll have the church service Saturday. I said, what church service? Well, she said, the one you wanted to have. Well, of course, we'd had it that day, the one I wanted to have. And he said, just bring him what you want and talk it over with him, and he'll work it up. So I really went to my prayer room, and I said, Lord, you really are putting things over on me, aren't you now? What are we going to do about this? I've done everything I know to do. They've confessed. But we got to get them in the church, and they are willing to go to the church. Now, you take over. And as I was praying, asking him for what he would do for Really, if you ask God what he would do, he'll always give you an answer. He said to me, do you remember a service that your missionary, Margaret Rue, sent you some years back? It was when she had first come back from China, and she was broken physically and going to the Bible school in New York City. And she heard of this healing service in the Church of the Heavenly Rest in New York City. And she'd gone around to attend the service and was healed. And so she'd mailed me this beautiful service, healing service. And, well, that was before I had written any books, and I didn't go around talking about healing in those days. And so I had hidden that program. I didn't want anyone to see me with it. But I knew where I'd hidden it. And the Lord said, go get that service and look it over. Well, I went and got that service, and it did look lovely. So I thought, well, now maybe this will do. I'll take this to that new minister. When I went down to get in the car, the postman had just arrived, and Sharing Magazine was in the mail. And I thought, oh, they always have wonderful things in that. I didn't take time to look into it, but I knew it always had something good in it, so I took that along. But there was the Christian Advocate also. And lo, on the front of the Christian Advocate was the picture of a powerhouse and a wire that coiled around. And here was the picture of a young man on a bed of illness. And it reached over to him. He had hold of this wire, and the wire spelled prayer. I thought, that's doing all right for a nice Methodist paper. I'll take that along, too. Now, this was a Presbyterian minister I was going to with a Methodist Advocate and an Episcopal Sharing. But that is what the Lord gave me. And so I went out and met this wonderful young minister, and I did love him. He said, you know, Ms. Eggleston, all my life I've wanted to help my parishioners who were sick. I've known that Jesus would know what to do and how to minister to them. I've always wanted this. I hope that I might find it fully in this. So I left him these things, and I said, now you look them over. And he'd already set the time, Saturday, and that was just a couple of days from then. And I said, phone me when you're ready, and I'll come and do anything you want me to do. So he phoned, and he said, you just meet me at the church an hour early. I found the most wonderful ritual service in here, but it's a Lutheran service. So the Lord does really do nice things, doesn't he? He was really making us everything. Well, the nice thing was that Charles and Bess wanted everyone in all the prayer groups in Norfolk who had had a part in praying for him to be present. That sanctuary, it was not the first church in the city. It was a small one. It would seat about half that this sanctuary would. But it was comfortably filled, all with prayer group members, but prayer group members of every Protestant church in Norfolk. Now we assembled, and this young minister and I were all prepared, and they began to come in. And he carried this beautiful Lutheran service through. It was a service of thanksgiving for a healing. And when he finished, he said, now, Miss Eggleston, if you'll stand back of Mrs. Brooks and make a prayer, it wouldn't have affected everyone in that group anymore. Now, he had finished praying, and I was just beginning my prayer. But the music took everything out of me. I couldn't speak another word to save my life. I just stood in mute silence before the wonder of God. When it was over, why, he was going to pronounce the benediction, but Charles said, Pastor, I'm not worthy to be a member of the church. For 12 years I haven't darkened a church door, and I've had bitterness in my heart, and it wouldn't be right for me to come back in the church without taking the allegiance again. Would you give me the ritual again. And then his wife said, "Neither am I worthy. Would you give it to me also?" So he looked up the ritual, and everyone in the room, Methodists, Baptists, Presbyterians, Episcopalians, Lutherans, Congregationalists, Christian disciples, we all took the Presbyterian vows that day. And none of us found anything there that would offend what we had been. It only made us more Christian. We all felt that we were one family under God. We all felt that we had helped to answer Jesus' prayer in that upper room, that we might all be one, even as he and the Father were one, that the world might believe. I wish you could have seen the change that took place in the Brooks family and the gifts that came to that boy. He seemed to understand everything that was going on around him, and as he asked to walk home that day, he said, "I don't want to ride home, I want to walk. It isn't more than a mile." And he said that as he walked home, that as he looked in the face of everyone he passed, he seemed to be able to see in them a son of God. He seemed to have the same love for them that Jesus had. And when he got home and stretched out in his big comfortable chair, he began saying a prayer in the Hebrew language. And he said it over and over and over, the same thing, the same tones. And she said, "Do you know what you're saying?" He said, "Yes, I can tell you exactly what it means. It's a prayer that Jesus made." And he told it. Well, Bess called me and said, "Come around here and listen." Well, before I came around, I phoned Reverend Faulkner. I said, "Do you know anything about the Hebrew language?" He said, "A little bit." I said, "Come around. Something amazing is happening." We met around there, and he was still saying this beautiful prayer. And it seemed to just lift him up and give him a new power that he'd never had before. I said to Mr. Faulkner, have you any idea what he's saying? He said, "I think I'd know something about it." Well, Bess said, "You tell him what you think it is." And so Charles told him what his interpretation is. And he said, "It's exactly right. It's exactly the thing that you were saying, and surely it must have been a prayer that Jesus made." You know, there's so much of the holy in the world today, and we pass it by unnoticed. We dwell in the human instead of in the divine as sons of God. And the world is starving to see God and to see the wonder of his love and the wonder of his way. Let's go back home to make him real. Let's go back home to put it in the churches, for that's where it belongs. It doesn't belong outside the church. It belongs in the church. For the church is the body of Christ. And it's the body of Christ that has been entrusted with the kingdom. Let's go home and live it.